everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be taking a look at transport and mobility trends in the urban environment. My name is Steve Kennett, and I look after the Cities and Built Environment portfolio here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our presenter today, Martyn Briggs, who's the Programme Manager for Mobility, Automotive and Transportation at consultants Frost & Sullivan. My presentation will last for around 20 minutes, which will leave us with 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and we'll wait till the end before answering as many as we can. If you should have any technical issues during the presentation, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll catch you as soon as I can. So without delay, I'd like to hand over to Martyn, who'll get us started with today's presentation. So over to you, Martyn.
Briggs, and I'm the Programme Manager for Mobility Research here at Frost & Sullivan. And as I'm sure Stephen has told you, we're a growth partnership company looking at market research and consulting in various teams. And what I'm going to do today, if you pass on to the second slide for me, Stephen, is to spend 20 minutes or so discussing how, firstly, megatrends will be impacting urban mobility and what the response of the market has been in a few case study examples ranging from the likes of micro-mobility to car sharing, integrated mobility and intelligent transport systems, and then also pass over to yourselves to ask a few questions at the end. So without further ado, if you pass on to the next slide for me, Stephen, I could probably spend about 20 minutes or so just talking about these megatrends that are impacting mobility, but I'm going to pick out on a few of them. Now, there's about 4 key things that I consider when we're looking at megatrends and how they impact the market. Is firstly urbanisation, social preferences, technology advancements, and the changing use of energy. Now, firstly, with urbanisation, for the first time towards the end of the last decade, over 50% of the population were living in urban areas. Now, this provides the kind of density that's needed for new mobility business models to flourish, and allows a different approach to mobility, if you like. And so anything that can provide rapid transit and reduce congestion and pollution in these urban areas is going to be seen favourable. Now, on the social preferences side, you're looking at things like Generation Y and how there are different preferences towards mobility and how that's been changing over the last decade or two. A good example of that is how here in London or in the UK, applications for driving licenses amongst younger drivers have reduced significantly over the last 10 years, around 9% amongst 18 to 29-year-olds. So that's kind of telling us a few things, but it could be to do with as more people move towards cities that they don't necessarily need to drive, or on the other hand, the kind of technology that's being provided to them reduces or removes the need to travel by car at all, and of course the investment in public transport that comes with that. And the kind of technology trends that we see are, of course, the connected world and smartphones that are changing not just mobility but all sorts of industries at the moment. And that allows a new platform and a new way to do business in many ways, and of course that impacts mobility greatly. On the energy side, there are certainly changing energy production, energy usage trends that we are seeing, and a couple of examples could be things like e-mobility and electric vehicles, for example, and how that will impact the sustainable cities of tomorrow. There's around 12 things there, and I'm going to pick on a couple of those as we go through today's presentation. And if there's anything of particular interest, then pick up at the end, and we'll give some more info afterwards. Now, next slide is to do with that first point of urbanisation. Now, in the context of urbanisation, we see that within that we will see many megacities over the next decades, with generally a population of 8 to 10 million or above. Now, as those cities start to get larger, we start to have mega regions where 2 megacities will combine. And as that trend continues and the transport corridors improve, that combines to give mega corridors. And equally in developing worlds where there's a rapid move towards certain cities, we see mega slums where you may have a million plus people living in one square mile. And that's these 4 trends are something that we cover within our megatrends research, and allows us to pick out some of the cities where these new mobility trends will be particularly adopted. So the next slide, that is quite linked to how we see smart cities across the world. Now, we have 8 factors that we use to pinpoint where some of these development areas would be, ranging from smart buildings to smart energy, smart mobility and smart infrastructure. And the reason why we do this to try and identify such cities is, of course, to see where it would be most likely to adopt a new mobility concept or a new solution, of course. Some examples may be areas like Amsterdam or Copenhagen, where there's a high propensity for cycling, and that's allowed more business models in itself, from bike sharing through to new infrastructure pure for cyclists to be provided, as an example. So interest around cities in both what we do and what the market is doing in general. So on the next slide, it shows basically how it's cities and not countries that will drive wealth generation in the future. And a good example is even like London, for example, where it accounts for 20% of the UK's GDP, but more interestingly, areas like Seoul or Brussels account for 55 to 50% of the country's GDP. Now, the reason why it's important is, of course, there's a lot of economic power in these areas and investment that will go towards the transport network in particular. And how companies are starting to respond to that is to get the city as a customer. And what that means is many divisions particularly aligned just towards targeting cities as their business and to leverage their portfolio to the full. A good example could be Siemens, where they've just set up their infrastructure and cities division, which is targeted purely on cities. They have a number of account managers that will target cities to say, we can build you around infrastructure, give you an intelligent transport systems network, congestion charging, or whatever it may be, and package up a solution tailored for a city. And that's definitely a trend, not just in infrastructure, but in various other things as well, the city as a customer. So on the next slide, a lot of our interest focuses on innovation, of course, and a good example is this quadrant we use in many of the workshops that we do to take an example of companies, how they would fit into this innovation quadrant. Now, some early solutions in mobility could include on the infrastructure side, where you have an unknown solution to a met need, something like an ITS or a traffic prediction system, which would fit in the top left of the quadrant, whereas something like a new mode or something like car sharing, that is a known solution. We've had cars for a long time, of course, but not in this context, would be on the bottom right. What is interesting is the wild side, if you like, the wild innovation, where there's new business models like a mobility integrator coming to the market to bring together a lot of all of the modes of transport into one offering. And I'll talk about some of the examples later on. We've done an interesting study on how that's starting to change the face of the market. One of the example products I mentioned, if you move to the next slide, Stephen, is the micro-mobility solutions that we are seeing now and will see over the next decade or so. Now, this is a new form of product that's aimed particularly at the last mile connectivity in cities. So it's certainly the vehicle manufacturers, these trends that we mentioned have not gone unnoticed. And we look at some of this opens up a new segment, if you like. And there's 4 classifications to this. The first is the number of wheels of the vehicle, the number of passengers that the vehicle could take, whether it's an open or closed top vehicle, and the type of powertrain it uses. And we've done a whole study around these models in particular. But the important thing to note is how this could replace many cars and give a whole new concept to urban mobility, starting to reduce the space that these vehicles take up, moving towards perhaps a quarter lane concept, as I heard at a recent conference, where people are starting to devise and build vehicles to take up less space and better use the existing infrastructure. And we'll see over 60 of these model variants over the next decade. And some early examples, you may have seen the Renault Twizy providing 2 people or 2 passengers in tandem, the recent acquisition of Ducati motorcycles from Audi, and how the BMW pedelec that you would have seen, the Olympics, these type of products that's come into the market. And for way of looking at that in Japan is how they are developing this for an aging society, so providing the last mile connectivity for their aging population. And so we'll see a lot more linking to robotics. So if we move to the next slide, another concept that we're looking at and have done a lot of research on is car sharing. Now, if you think of some of the trends that we spoke about in my first slide, how younger people are necessarily not driving as much, potentially, that there's a lot of urbanisation and propensity for this type of model in more and more cities around the world. The increasing technology, the use of location-based services and smartphones to book, reserve and pay this type of service, and a consciousness of reducing one's cost of mobility. So the kind of trends are all combining to bring and to grow this type of model. And in Europe, I think there's around 1 million members that we found in the survey that we did, around 1 million in Europe now. But the growth rate is phenomenal. I mean, it's been 20% for the last couple of years. Now, how this is going to grow, we believe will be up to 15 million members by 2020 of a car sharing scheme in over 240,000 vehicles. And what's interesting in that is how this is different across the different countries. So the next slide, and the other point is how the model is, although it's relatively in its youth, is starting to diverge and converge with other industries as well. Now, peer-to-peer car sharing is very interesting. How if you're not perhaps emotional about your vehicle and start to consider that as a commodity or an asset, if you like, that could make you money whilst you're at work, then why not share it with your neighbour or as part of a P2P car sharing scheme? And this is something that's really started to take off, particularly in the UK, France and Germany. And we see that there will be over 750 members in 2020, but of course that will use more of the vehicles, more of a vehicle fleet where people will passively share their vehicle as and when people demand it. But the interesting point is how even a new trend and a new business model like car sharing is starting to change, and there are now 3 or 4 models even within that. So with my next slide, a good example of that is BMW. So if you look at this from the eyes of a vehicle manufacturer, again, it's something that they certainly want to get involved with. First point is on their business-to-business platform. The Alpha City is providing a new corporate car sharing service, where obviously they're targeting business customers to use and improve of pool vehicles and sweat the assets more. And they have a B2C personal car sharing scheme called Drive Now, which is providing one-way trips for customers, and also the new BMW On Demand model, whereby people will be able to use vehicles from the dealer network, so on a short-term basis. So those 3 strategies in itself provides an overview of how BMW can see that they're looking to lock in brand loyalty from new customers and new customer segments at a young age, and they don't actually see car sharing as a threat to their business, but rather an opportunity. So the next slide, my last point on car sharing really, is how this is starting to converge, and that's interesting because it's different across the 3 main countries in Europe for car sharing. In Germany, this is really driven by the vehicle manufacturers themselves. So the likes of BMW that I just mentioned have and Daimler their Car2Go scheme as well. Whereas in the UK, this is driven much more by the car sharing organisations themselves. So Zipcar are the largest, City Car Club and those type of companies are really dominating the market here in the UK. Whereas in France, it's driven by the transport operators. So people like Veolia have the largest part of the market share there at the moment. So, and the point here is, of course, how there's an opportunity for this to start to converge, and leasing companies are coming to the market, such as ALD and LeasePlan, with their concepts as well. And inevitably, this will offer a convergence within the industry. Next slide is looking at more of the multimodal opportunities. Now, the reason for me being interested in mobility and getting involved at Frost & Sullivan is that my experience is not in the automotive industry, but more in the public transport and sustainable transport community. And so the concept of how people are now not considering whether they take the car or the train, they're starting to remove some of the barriers. It's no longer one or another, but these modes are all complementary. And really interesting because it provides a lot of new business models and a lot of new thinking around the way that we get from A to B, and how we move goods and people alike. So the point here on this slide is showing that as we move towards 2020, and we'll start to see a lot of more mobility integration, and so it allows us to make the best possible choice with our transport, and of course we need to be educated on the modes of transport that are out there, and it needs to be as easy as possible. So as we get more information, whether I have an app on a smartphone or a ticket that allows me to do all of these things, I can make the best choice for myself. And people will always change where there's a better alternative, but of course they need to be educated on what is, and it needs to be easy and convenient for them to do it. So on the next slide, I've taken a few examples from a recent study we did. This is focusing a bit more on some of the leasing companies and car companies, but there's a couple of examples there how transport operators are also coming to the market to combine things like car leasing and car sharing, public transport offering, parking management, long-distance travel, and other mobility concepts as well. And as you start to piece more of these together, we're really starting to see an integration across modes. And then business card that is a good example of how it's doing that, and also not just targeting customers but targeting businesses as well, and allowing a monthly billing system whereby people can move towards a mobility budget rather than a company car budget or the traditional travel expense system. And there's certainly a lot of interest around that type of mobility budget and how it works in practice. On my next slide is really focusing on connectivity. Now, I couldn't conclude without talking about how this connectivity is affecting the marketplace. There are many solutions out there, of course, and the future is certainly looking to be a green, integrated, smart, interoperable transport infrastructure. And what we mean by some of this is how it's kind of driven by policy and enforcement on the one hand, so we'll have potentially a lot more electronic tolling, congestion charging, and the infrastructure in place to do that. Again, it provides a lot of new business models to the market to bring new concepts, whether it be car sharing or electric vehicles and the like. And the other thing is, of course, information, and I mentioned that already, but as we have a more connected infrastructure, it of course allows more real-time information to be passed on to the consumers to allow them to make the best possible decision. And this diagram was taken from the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, who believe that this is really the way that Europe will be in the future, that will be integrated across many different countries, and they're working towards that with Ertico, the ITS network, indeed, to make that happen. I'll start to move towards my conclusions now. If we move to the next slide, I'll start to move over to the floor now and consider, is the future James Bond driving around town in my Aston Martin? Or next slide, is it more Jason Bourne in my Beta taxi in that case, or on a bike or on the tube or by foot? So that's the question that I'd like to leave with all, and hopefully I can answer any questions you now have. So if I move to the next slide, there's just a couple of plugs there of how you can keep in touch. Firstly, with the book of our boss, Sullivan Singh, has written a book about new megatrends and how it will impact our future lives. And we have two LinkedIn groups on both trends and the future of mobility. Last slide now, you can keep contact details and of course ask any questions you may have after the webinar, or indeed on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. So it's a bit of a whirlwind helicopter view of what we're doing here at Frost & Sullivan at the moment, and how we see the future of urban mobility. And I'll like to answer any questions you now have.
Great, fantastic. Thanks for that, Martyn. Really fascinating insight there into what's happening. And just to let a few people have asked whether or not we'll be making those LinkedIn links available. So I'll send those out later on with the link to the recording. So we'll go straight into the Q&A session now. We've had quite a few questions come in. I think quite a nice general one to start off with is who's with it to lead the way towards this better integration of transport and mobility services, which you've kind of talked about today. Do you want to sort of share some views on that, Martyn?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few. I mean, a few views. I guess that it needs to be linked to public policy is the first thing, but also the private sector. I think if we look in somewhere like the UK, we're doing some work with the Technology Strategy Board, for example, and they see themselves as having to almost pump some initiatives and some funding, of course, into the market to assist with some of these trends to really take off. But nevertheless, I don't think it's now about building the necessary infrastructure from a government perspective. There's many opportunities and enough opportunities that this throws up for the public sector to really take a hold and take a lead on some of this. And that can range from a small scale, an SME perspective, from apps through to on initiatives, and then at a larger scale we see a lot more of the OEMs and the vehicle manufacturers and transport operators getting involved in this, and of course they're the ones that have slightly deeper pockets and certainly able to invest in this type of initiative. So it ranges from both, I guess, the public sector to the private sector initiative, but much more reliance now is coming from the private sector than it would have done in previous years.
Great, thanks, Martyn. So towards the end of your presentation, you mentioned Generation Y, and somebody in the audience here has also highlighted a recent report in the US, which indicated about, especially amongst the younger generation, are now driving less and using their cars much less. They're asking, what sort of time frames do you think cities need to be working towards to deal with the impact of this drop-off in car usage?
Do you mean from a timescale perspective? Do you mean deal with it from a positive perspective, or?
Yes,
Or
I guess what they mean is in terms of putting in more public infrastructure and those type of services in order to sort of absorb the impact of that.
Whereas it depends on what's there already. In areas like London, there, where obviously I'm a bit biased because that's where I am at the moment, but it's very well developed at the moment. It's been developed over a series of decades. So I guess where these trends are really taking off, there is a need for infrastructure where it's not there already, and if it's not, then there can be things that can be done relatively quickly. So it could be a bus rapid transit system, for example, or a bike sharing scheme on a smaller scale. Whereas as we move towards a light rail or high-speed rail network, that would take more time to implement. But what we do see is over the next decades how the car sharing in the developed cities is really starting to reduce quite a lot. And I remember, I think it was London, we'd forecast was car ownership will reduce by 15% over the next 8 years to 2020, and the numbers were similar in New York and Tokyo. So if you look at those type of numbers, then it needs to be relatively soon that people move to take advantage of those situations, and that's where in this like car sharing companies are moving fast to take some of that opportunity, because they can, as long as they can get the capital, move to get the assets on the ground quickly.
Thanks, Martyn. Next question. Someone's asking, city moving towards mobility integration and car sharing, but having any evidence of this in towns across the UK and Europe, how do you make it viable with lower density areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess that depends more on the scale of the options that are there already. Now, on the slide, we'd highlighted, I think, about 10 to 15 different options that are there, ranging from more heavy infrastructure through to ferries and things that obviously get very dependent on where you are. So again, I think there are certain things that can be done, and it will. We may need to focus on things like walking and cycling, where people make trips on a relatively short distance, but then where there is a need for longer distance, or those densities are lower, then it may not be, in my opinion, too much of a negative policy perspective to encourage some of the driving on certain areas, and where car sharing can play a role. Because in my mind, it doesn't make as much sense to start providing the public transport networks where there's not that density to make it profitable. I think as we move forward, obviously we know that there's a lot about budget deficits here in the UK and a lot of the Western world. It's not necessarily going to make sense to provide and force people into using public transport where it's not viable. There are many other options that can be leveraged that are still sustainable, that would work. So we can take that offline, and I can give a few more contextual answers if need be. The bigger opportunities, of course, are nevertheless where there is that density to make it worthwhile.
Thanks, Martyn. Next question: do you see moves towards a single payment card or approach for different types of public transport? For example, Auto plus the Boris bike plus Zipcar.
Yes, definitely, and I believe that there's already discussions underway to make that happen. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges to make that happen, and but nevertheless, in the future, it has to really. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't do that. The only barriers are around the data sharing and some of the commercial elements, but there's enough technology in place to anonymize who's using this to get everyone on board, and I don't think it will be very long at all before we see that, because we're already starting to see the opportunities with the journey planners to cross cities and indeed cross borders. So as long as there's the desire there by the user and of course from the public sector, I know that there's been some more funding announced for smart ticketing in the UK recently under the local sustainable transport fund, and it's definitely a hot topic that will continue.
Thanks, Martyn. Also, your presentation referenced North America and the EU as leaders in integrated multimodal connected transportation systems. Where do you think China and key cities like Beijing and Shanghai are on this?
I know that they have their own similar to the Oyster cards. So I know that people can get around on a multimodal basis using those cards. I forget what the names are, but I can certainly find out. But where they are is that it's obviously very driven by the policy and the government in that case. Nevertheless, there is such a scale there that if you compare even things like car ownership, I think here in the UK it's around 46 to 50 cars per 100 people compared to 2 per 100 in China, and there is such more mass population that they require more mobility on a public transport basis. And I saw a new bus rapid transit that was being piloted in Germany, or the new bus that was being piloted in Germany, that's going to be dedicated to Beijing and Shanghai, in fact, and it was the longest bus I've ever seen. So there is certainly the opportunity there to leverage these particular modes. But to answer your question in full, I guess that they are certainly, it's on their radar, and they have cards there to make that happen. And indeed, we've done a mobility integration report on Europe, and our next task is to look at China specifically, and we're doing a table of contents to do that. So it will be going to be better in 2 months' time.
Great, thanks, Martyn. Next question here. Consider growth in rail use in the UK over the past 5 years. Do you think the political support for high-speed rail is just too far behind the demand? And do you feel it is now up to the private sector to drive it forward? I'm torn because I moved to Ebbsfleet International Station when they built the high-speed network. So I am a big fan of the high-speed trains and the concept, but nonetheless, all of what I do is really look at business models now. I've moved from a sustainable transport consultancy, mostly looking with the public sector, to now focusing with private sector clients. And I think you're right, that there does need to be a very strong business case in my mind to invest such large sums. I think it's 32 billion or something Speed 2 is going to cost to build, and I think it should be done as long as there is a proven business case there. And I know that the BCRs are changing by the month at the moment. So I think that whoever that is correct. There needs to be more of a business case, and potentially being led by the private sector. And some of the McNulty report that was released last year is, I guess, moving towards addressing that, because it's trying to reduce the reliance of the public sector and either derive more revenue from the fares or get more input from the private sector directly. But it's not easy with the kind of legacy that we have and the high cost base that we have on the rail network. It's going to take some time to make that decision, which is why there's so many consultations underway at the moment. Thanks, Martyn. So next up, the micro mobility units have caught the imagination of the audience here. And quite a question someone's raised is, how applicable are these both to extreme cold and hot weather conditions? Yeah, and that's why I think one of the criteria, when I mentioned about open and closed top vehicles, that a choice would be made. So it's it's not necessarily it would be one or the other, I guess, in that case. But you're right. There's in climates in certain areas, one might not be applicable. Anywhere with a warm climate is, of course, more attractive for those that are open top, and where it's particularly cold and non-accessible in places, then it has to be a closed top. But the reason why this is interesting, particularly in the two things really. One, in the developed world, as people are starting to increase their wealth, they may not necessarily have the money to go and buy a traditional car, but they may be able to afford something slightly cheaper, such as this, which still allows the personal mobility that we've funded in the past. However, in the developed world, there's almost more, with recessionary pressures and also looking to reduce the cost of our mobility, it kind of answers that question or that need as well, and it's sustainable, and you can store it easily, and it answers a few of the trends that we discussed. So there's two different angles on it which will increase the demand, and that's why we've seen many of the new vehicles and new concepts come into the market. And you're right, it's very interesting and exciting, and they look quite cool and innovative, so it's really interesting. And I guess how some of the M's have approached that is to adding different business models to their portfolio. I mentioned Audi and Ducati, but there are other examples as well as where that's happening, and it's set to continue. Thanks, Martyn. So I'm conscious of time, but I think we've got enough time for a couple more questions. Yeah, sure. And there's one here, which is, any suggestions really for how to generate support amongst the general public implementing and running urban transport systems and mobility services, and how do you go about raising awareness to improve acceptance?
Could you repeat that? Improve awareness from the customer, from our perspective, do you mean? Or?
Yeah, well, amongst the general public. So I guess the people who are going to be using the transport system, how do you go about making them more aware of it and accepting the I guess the greater use of public transport, but in this kind of mobility service scenario?
I think we see all the traditional modes of how advertising and how information is disseminated still would work, but there's a lot of new channels now that can be used, and that can be ranging from whether it be social media to new e-retailing and e-advertising methods, the kind of deals and new concepts that are out there. A good example maybe recently, if people use something like Groupon or O2 Moments, if you go on something like that, you can now get £20 of free streetcar credit. So it's almost offering now, a mobility solution through that new way of shopping. And that's one example. But there could be other ways whereby the information is disseminated through applications. And I guess in the longer term, the demand or the desire, I guess, would be to have as few outlets as possible. So where in the UK we have something like Transport Direct, for example, that feed in a lot more data from private developers to give a single source of mobility. And I heard last week of the example from carpooling.com, where they're starting to work with a lot of, although they're a carpooling website, traditionally they now work with different modes, the rail and even the airlines to give people the option of you pick two routes or two cities, you can get deals on all of the modes and make the choice which is more applicable to you. So I think from the public's perspective, this information should be disseminated both electronically and through the traditional methods of advertising as we know it.
Thanks, Martyn. There's a sort of follow-on to that, and someone's asking, most of the transit is commuting to work. How do you see employers getting involved with these initiatives?
Yes. Well, that's another interesting concept. I guess that the way even that we're working is very different now, and it's really starting to change. I was at a conference recently where Cisco announced the concept of bring the work to the worker, which is not necessarily anything new. We've had things like the internet for a while, but the way that people are now starting to work from home a lot, and it was tested very much so during the Olympics. There's a lot or a bigger opportunity to reduce your overheads in expensive office space I'm sat in Victoria at the moment. It's probably a very expensive office. There's an opportunity to remove some of that cost and improve the efficiency of the office. So to answer your question, I think we'll see a lot more of the connected working and mobile working, and an early response to that. If you look at one of the largest office companies, Regis, they're starting to provide offices at motorway service stations and in a lot more rural destinations where you can rent it on an hourly basis or can rent on a temporary basis, or to allow people to use whatever office is for them. So that's certainly something that I see will change as well. And the other thing is how cost or price of travel can be differentiated to allow the spreading of the traditional peaks of transport from 9 and 5 to allow that to spread across the day. And a good example is, of course, the rail industry has started to do that with the advanced purchase tickets, and I think that's certainly something that can continue on a mass scale, not just in high speed and long distance travel, but in commuting as well. If you made it half the price, people may consider moving the times, and do they really need to travel at 30, for example?
Thanks, Martyn. And just one final question. Someone's asking, with shifting demographics in many cities and an increasingly aging population, what impact do you see this having on mobility and transport services, and do you think it will have an impact?
Yes, I think it will for two reasons. I mean, we're seeing a very big shift in the automotive industry, how some suppliers are starting to brand themselves, so they're targeting younger customers by really focusing on technology and new concepts, new business models, whereas the aging population are still their core market and still, definitely the ones that have the money to spend on the vehicles. So they're still advertising through the size of the engine, the 0 to 60, and all of those traditional elements. So even within a company's portfolio, they have to approach things differently on within their same product range. And on the other side to that, was how things will change from an accessibility point of view. Our transport networks will need to become more accessible with in mind, as you say, and it's not necessarily sustainable for people to be driving into a particularly late age. I think I read a stat that drivers at the age of 85 are 5 times more likely to be in an accident than the average. So things would need to change, and we need to do more from an infrastructure point of view to allow that to happen, whether it be through pure accessibility lifts and things like that, or just innovative concepts of how we actually get people from A to B. And even if you looked at a wild innovation concept, many of you would have been on the personal rapid transit at Heathrow. I've heard many people say how in the future, as we design city or design new cities, things like that can actually play a good role in a feeder system, which allows people to jump into something like that and have a personal mode of transport. But what we don't want to do is kind of go too far down that road, because we want people to still be able to walk and cycle and make use of sustainable modes to counter the increasing obesity that we see in some of our economies.
Great, well thanks Martyn. So that's all we've time for today, but I'd like to thank Martyn for his time and getting through so many questions, and also for everyone who joined us for this webinar. Just for you, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform, and for the questions we didn't get time to answer, we'll post up in a forum for you to discuss further. So
sure.
Me
too. Yeah. If you want to get them to, or if you want to pass any of those on to me as well, Stephen, I can just shout, and I'm happy to get back to people as well. So
okay, that would be great. Thanks, Martyn. Okay, I hope everyone found today informative and useful, and that you'll be able to join us for our further webinars throughout September. So thank you.
Thank you, Ron.